So the third presentation now is more a conceptual and methodological point, or points, several, namely on the measurement of formal education and its harmonization in the context of PIAAC Cycle 2. I will briefly give some background information, also as regards the measurement in PIAAC Cycle 1. Then I'll talk about the measurement of education in PIAAC Cycle 2, what was changed in the process. And then I'll come to a brief process and output evaluation and brief conclusions. So what's the relevance and the challenge of measuring education, formal education, in comparative repeated cross-section surveys? The relevance of formal education, I probably don't have to say much in the context of this conference here. Educational attainment is the most important predictor and also certifier of adult skills, and a crucial background variable, not only but especially in PIAAC. So educational systems are meant to, of course, convey skills, and with the examinations and processes for assessing skills, they give certificates that usually have high signaling power in the labor market to certify these skills. More broadly, in social science research, education affects outcomes that are highly valuable to individuals and societies, such as productivity, so that's the human capital perspective, income and job quality, but also health and well-being, somewhat more soft indicators that have gained relevance in the last decades, I would say, but also attitudes such as openness to immigration, which is quite crucial in many countries today. Education transmits disadvantage or advantage across generations. That's the more sociological part of me, stressing this factor a lot. And we'll also have a presentation afterwards on educational inequalities across countries here. And education also seemingly legitimates inequalities in later life. So the challenge of measuring education in comparative repeated cross-sectional surveys such as PIAAC, even though PIAAC is not just a survey, but it also is a survey. The first challenge is comparability across the participating countries, because we have differences between educational systems, but also in the everyday language on education, how people talk about it and how you can access this information in a questionnaire context. So the questionnaire items need to be adapted by countries. You cannot take ISCED levels, translate them into the language, and then give that to respondents. So the resulting country-specific variables then afterwards need to be recoded into some internationally comparable target variable. And for this tool, we have the International Standard Classification of Education, which is used in all OECD and Eurostat studies, and therefore also in PIAAC Cycle 2. We also, because we have a longer stretch of assessments, and particularly PIAAC Cycle 1 and 2, we have the challenge of keeping comparability over time. But we do have changes in educational systems and also in the tools for rendering education data comparable, such as ISCED and the ISCED mappings, which I'll talk about in a bit. So the earlier adaptations from Cycle 1 and the harmonization rules cannot be simply reused. So different international target variables need to also be nested to have a common parent, so you can find a common framework across points in time of data collection. So PIAAC measurement of education. First, I will look at some of the weaknesses in PIAAC Cycle 1 and how PIAAC reacted to this for Cycle 2. So, and that is definitely not the fault of PIAAC Cycle 1 or anything, so there's nothing to blame really, but time has passed and the development work for PIAAC Cycle 1 was done at exactly the time when ISCED 2011 was being developed. So it is still based on the previous version, ISCED 97. Another point is that a distinction that was already present in ISCED 97 but has gained more visibility maybe in ISCED 2011 is the distinction between general and vocational education. And this was not substantively and from the outset reflected in the PIAAC Cycle 1 measures. And we know that for labor market outcomes, the distinction is quite relevant, especially in countries that have strong vocational education systems. We also had, in Cycle 1, limited information on respondents' educational careers. It's already more than most other surveys of the general population have, but it was only educational attainment, so the highest qualification, enrollment, current education, as well as dropout, so education pursued but not resulting in the qualification. And fourthly, there was limited consortium support regarding the education adaptation and harmonization for countries, because that's quite a difficult process, and some national teams are here at the conference and can maybe confirm that. So the questions driving the refinements in Cycle 2 are the following. Firstly, how can ISCED 2011 be implemented without threatening comparability with Cycle 1 data? And how does vocational and professional education compare to general and academic education with regards to adult skills and other outcomes measured in PIAAC? And these questions are attacked via the use of an extended target education coding scheme that I will briefly show you in a bit. Then, in terms of the concepts and the educational career, the question was really how the educational pathway taken through an educational system affects skill development and other outcomes of formal education. And for this, a new questionnaire item was developed after the BPC, the Board of Participating Countries, has asked about such a measure. And with this, we want to better understand the processes of skill formation across countries and the role of educational system in sorting people into the labor market. And finally, how can countries be better supported in adapting and harmonizing education measures to maximize data quality, which involves reliability, validity, and also comparability? And that is covered by a new education consultation process, which I will also very briefly line out. So the first innovation is the more detailed coding scheme. I show this here to you, and it looks quite unwieldy. It's not quite as bad as the International Standard Classification of Occupations, but it's almost or a bit more places than the official ISCED classification. So in this column here, you can see the categories, the detailed education categories from PIAAC Cycle 1, and these were further refined in Cycle 2 by introducing particularly the differentiation between vocational and general consistently in every category, pretty much. So it's been modeled a bit on the European Total Survey variable that I had developed for the ESS about 10 years earlier, and which had been in use for quite a while, but it's more closely tied to ISCED 2011. So ISCED 2, which is something that's different from the official ISCED, is that we here distinguish between comprehensive or not differentiated education systems at the lower secondary level compared to education systems that track students in the lower secondary level already to pre-vocational, vocational versus more academically oriented education, which is relevant for people's later pathways, but also their skill development in schools. Because this is hardly ever the highest attainment of people, that's mostly relevant for the measurement of educational pathways. And at ISCED levels 3 to 7, we do split by vocational and general, as I indicated before. And additionally, at ISCED 6 and 7, that's also relevant to the later presentation on inequality in higher education, is that we differentiate between what is considered higher education within participating countries, because ISCED doesn't do that really. So in some countries we find qualifications from the vocational education system in ISCED 6 and 7. So when we talk about tertiary education, we always need to make sure that it's not the same thing as higher education, at least not in all countries. And that may also introduce heterogeneity in skills in these levels. There's also derived variables, but I'll not talk about these now here in much detail. Regarding the new measurement of pathways, I'll keep that quite quick. There was an item added to the background questionnaire which asked about other qualifications that people have obtained before their highest. So that's to check all that apply questions so that we have at least some minimal information on how people got to where they are at the end of their educational career. And I will not talk about the other items. The education consultation process, I also don't want to go into this too deeply now because I have some numbers that I prefer to show you as well on actual results, but it meant that the PIAAC consortium, which I am a member of, prepared materials and went to an exchange with countries to make sure that the adapted questionnaire items firstly fulfill national goals and are usable by respondents in the countries, but can be coded into the international coding frame that I just showed you, and that we have a way of dealing with also changes over time. So now to the process and output evaluation. What proved to be difficult and what could be done better for potential PIAAC Cycle 3. I will first talk a bit about the process and challenges here. Sometimes the aims and motivation for changes were not entirely clear, I must admit, and it was sometimes difficult to get this information. So, for example, what is actually meant by the educational pathway, and it was not what we thought sometimes. The biggest challenge really was, I think, that some countries adapt education items much more than others, which leads to very complex consultation processes, derivation procedures, and quality assurance checks in the consortium. And so some countries really needed 10 to 20 times the resources than other countries. Finally, detailed data, such as that what we achieve with the more detailed coding framework, conflicts with perceived risk of de-anonymization. And so we have more information in the data which we would like to use for research, but countries suppressed a lot of detailed variables, which means that a lot of the work that was done and went into this is kind of thrown out of the window. But I hear that the OECD is working on this, and I'm hopeful that in the not too far future we can work on the full data with the OECD as well. But currently there's no international scientific use file. Germany has published one, which is great, but not comparative. The lessons learned here are that we need to improve the information flow between particularly also the BPC, OECD, and PMs and consortium in some areas, better understand country needs, and also consortium resources and ambitions. OECD is working on improving their research data management and access practices already, so this is hopefully will be something that I can cross out soon, and we'll see. Just spoke to Anja in the break. So now let's come to some output evaluation. The most available education variable that we have is this ADCAT6 trend cycle 1 variable, and I'll show you what it looks like briefly. The distributions in this is not very well balanced, as with all variables that catch ISCED main levels. So we have 40% of cases across countries in ISCED level 3 for a variable that has 6 categories. That's not so great, and 70% even in the Czech Republic, and more than 50% across the 2 lowest categories. And ISCED 4 and 5 are rather small, so it's not very efficient in terms of how categories are used. Also doesn't well predict literacy skills in all countries, as I will show you. For the ESS, I have about 15 years ago developed the European survey version of ISCED, which takes the detailed ISCED codes and recodes them differently into a similar number of categories, but in a way that is substantively more meaningful and differentiates better. And this one can be produced from the detailed ISCED variable, and for countries that suppressed it, there's also a workaround. So, and there's also the useful supporting variable VET in cycle 2, which is one of the derived variables that's included in the public use files as well, and I'll show this very briefly also. Now, looking at the distributions of this ADCAT6 variable, when you look across countries, this is here for all countries. You can already see the dominance of the 2 lowest categories and the extreme results here, the Czech Republic, where most people really are in ISCED 3, which is just not great analytical value. In other countries, it looks better. Now, looking at the ES-ISCED variable that I just introduced to you, it looks more colorful because the variable distributes better across countries, but also in countries like the Czech Republic, where this large ISCED 3 is broken up into 2 levels. Just briefly, linear regression results for literacy skills in Czechia. Maybe it's worth just highlighting that when you look at a model with just 3 education categories versus 6 categories and this ES-ISCED predicting literacy skills, this is the model that we most often see in publications. Here you get some more details and already see that there's a vast difference between ISCED 3 and 4 in Czechia, and these are actually quite similar. And when you realign the ISCED with access and without access to tertiary education, you see huge differences. Sorry, I'll finish soon. Huge differences between these two categories, which kind of appear in an average effect here. And here you have 8% more explanatory powers. And you get a significant gender effect in this model, but not in the others. So that's what you lose when you aggregate a lot. I will skip the results here for Germany and the USA, looking at the distinction between vocation and general, but I'm happy to show this later if you like. So the refined procedures for Cycle 2 likely improve the information content and comparability, but we'll need to see what empirical research using the data can actually produce and show its full potential, or say, well, this is not worth it. We'll see that. Now, because the data is not currently fully available to the research community, we cannot do all this work yet and check it. For Germany, you can use the German scientific use file, of course. So, thank you. And there's a preprint available for this paper as well.